I'm Miss Lottie from Olympian High School. We're going to be using the Traditions and Encounters textbook to look at changes to gender. We'll start on page 1156. We'll be looking at this section, Crossing Boundaries, and the first subheading is Women's Traditions and Feminist Challenges. So first thing I want you to know is that there are going to be changes to women's rights, obviously, over the last 50 years, especially after World War II. And those changes vary depending on what part of the world you're in, whether you're in a communist country, a country that's more developed, more industrialized, or a country that's poor and less industrialized. The impact of women's rights movements will be varied. They will be different. So just acknowledging that it's not the same for women in every part of the world. So as I said, women gained the right to vote in most countries in the world after the First World War. That's called the Great War, World War I. But just because they gained the right to vote doesn't mean they were on parity. They achieved parity with men, that they were equal. So it's about trying to gain access to those economic, political, social, sexual rights, especially in industrialized countries, more so than in developing countries. Sometimes they challenge cultural norms. These are like standards by which women are supposed to behave through different movements. And sometimes this is because of lack of equality in the workplace, access to jobs or inability to move up in your position, not being paid the same amount as men. In industrializing countries, about half the population is women, but that doesn't mean that they make the same amounts as men do. In developing countries, it's about 20%. In Islamic countries, this number, I'm sure, needs to be updated, but in the past, it was about 10% of the workforce. If we did a quick Google search, I'm sure we could find a more up-to-date number, but I'm sure it's improved. That said, there are certain jobs that are seen as more traditionally female, more acceptable for females to take on, things like teaching, where you're working with children, service positions, clerical jobs, more menial jobs. In parts of Africa, women make up the majority of the workforce as farmers, but they're not always allowed to enter more highly paid professional careers. There's discrimination against women in the workforce. After World War II, there were a lot more women wanting to protest job discrimination, pay differentiation. In the 1960s, there was a feminist movement that gained momentum and oftentimes was inspired by civil rights movement. And so in the civil rights movement, many women learned some of the organizing techniques that they would later apply to women's rights and feminist rights. We need to understand that gender is not necessarily a biological construct. Now, of course, some people will disagree with me on this, but we could think of gender as being a socially constructed or culturally constructed way of behaving. So it's not necessarily tied to your biology. Having the ability to have access to birth control methods and abortion helps women have the right to liberty over their bodies, whether or not they want to keep a fetus or not. So one of the things I'd like you to know about is the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's going to prohibit discrimination on the basis of not just race, but also sex. You have the introduction of a birth control pill in the 1960s, and you have the legal protection of abortion in the 1970s with a really famous court case called Roe versus Wade, 1973. And of course, I'm talking about America here. No, that's paused. I don't know what's happening here. I'm going to try to close whatever this is. Geez, okay. I'm trying to show you, this is a really famous court case. This is Norma Mccorvey, the woman that was originally sort of known anonymously as Jane Roe, I believe. Jane Roe. And she and this court case are really important because at the end of this court case, you have the legal protection of abortion. Now, in more recent history, there's been a lot of challenges to this court case and the fear that states are going to try to overturn some of these earlier court cases. But for now, abortion is protected in the United States. Something that never passed, that you should remember for your exam, was this attempt to pass an Equal Rights Amendment. It just wasn't ratified or agreed to before the 1982 deadline, but there was an attempt to make progress on the front of feminist movement by passing this amendment. It just never was passed. This section here talks about gender equality in China. In some ways, in communist countries, women's rights matched more closely men's rights, at least on paper. What I mean by that is that, like, technically they had similar rights, but because of the Confucian, remnants of vestiges of the Confucian system, women don't always exercise those rights. But communist laws, like, for example, Mao Zedong, famous communist leader of China, the first one, used to say women hold up half the sky, trying to say how important they are to society. So in 1950, communist leaders passed a marriage law that made it illegal to sort of force women into child betrothal and gave women equal access to inheritance. So they gained a lot of rights. But as I said, that doesn't mean that they were, 100% equal to men. For example, we don't see very high status women in the Communist Party's leadership. We also see that they don't always receive the same wages as men. As I mentioned, Confucian values persist, especially in rural areas, and interfere with women's ability to exercise their rights. And then you have this problem of families preferring boys over girls. Now, this is a really big deal because for a long time, China had what was called a one-child policy. This was ended, I want to check the exact year, close this, you can take a look, 2015. So in 2015, Chinese government ended its one-child policy. But while the one-child policy was in place, what ended up happening is families reported the less births of female children. And so there was a theory that potentially families were either killing or giving away for adoption their female girls, which led to an imbalance of men over girls in their society. I've been to China twice, and I can tell you that even today there persists a cultural preference to only have one child. We'll see if that changes in the future, but families tend to prefer having boys over girls. We'll see how that changes in the future. So again, there are all these missing girls for a long time because of this preference for girls. Okay, so here I want you to know that women are not always able to have access to education. The ability to read and write is called literacy, and in some societies, women fell behind men in terms of literacy. In some Arab and Muslim states, not all, women have had to struggle with higher rates of illiteracy. Same with South Asia. Speaking of South Asia, one of the biggest countries in South Asia is India. And we see a lot of problems in India with the feminist movement. So women don't always have the same ability to have access to jobs there, so their labor participation is low. They don't have as much availability of birth control. Oftentimes they're relegated to a life of domesticity in the home. One big issue in India is something called dowry debts. A dowry is something that is often like a gift of money that's given to a husband by the wife's family when she gets married. And what sometimes happens is men will kill their wife in order to keep the dowry and then remarry. And in order to do that, they might pretend that there was a kitchen accident. They'll douse their wives with kerosene and then set them on fire. This doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. And this practice is also spreading to places like Pakistan. So I think when I looked up a more recent number of dowry deaths, I believe this is from 2015, about 7,600 women are reported killed. And your book estimates that maybe up to 25,000 women a year are killed in these dowry deaths. So you can learn about this on your own. Obviously, the pain of possibly surviving being set on fire, this kind of abuse is horrendous. So this is describing to you the spread of this practice to Pakistan and the suffering that women have to deal with in these countries. When I was traveling in India in 2011, I was very scared, even during the day. I'm not saying that all parts of India are unsafe, but certainly there are some parts of India can feel less safe. And I think the year that I went, or the year after, there was a very famous rape case where a woman and her boyfriend were traveling, and they were raped and killed on a bus by 4 men. So it's a little bit, women have less rights in these areas. These kinds of things can happen in any country, but in India, there's starting to be more of a movement to end this sort of lack of women's rights and abuse of women that takes place in society. Around the world, most women have the right to vote, but that doesn't always mean that they achieve leadership positions. I'm going to talk a little bit about Aung San Suu Kyi. There's been a change to her more recently because of the situation. There's been a coup in Myanmar in 2021, this year. But you can read in your book about some parts of the world where women have achieved leadership positions. Read about Indira Gandhi, Benazir Bhutto. Take a look at Kumaratanga and Bandaraniki, I'm trying to say that correctly, and especially look at Aung San Suu Kyi. This was the leader of a place called Myanmar. It used to be called Burma. And Aung San Suu Kyi, I want to make sure I say her name correctly, worked really hard to advocate for democratic reform of the government. This government had largely been led basically by what she said was a fascist government. It was more like military control. She eventually achieved a Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts and became the leader of Myanmar. But just recently, there was a coup, a military coup in 2021, because of supposedly unfair elections. But she herself has come under a lot of criticism because there are a group of Muslims here that many people say that she didn't, that have been abused, and that she hasn't intervened or done enough to step up for the Rohingya Muslims. This is a complicated issue, but you should certainly take a look at this on your own, study it a little bit more. But there have been women who have achieved positions of political leadership. So we see some women becoming visible political leaders. The United Nations tried to launch a program called the Decade for Women in 1975. In Islamic countries, sometimes women are under more conservative cultures that want women to, stay home. But even in Iran, which saw the Islamic Revolution, we saw women challenging traditional gender roles by using guns and weapons and participating in some military activity. The other thing I just want to mention briefly is more recently a movement called the Metoo Movement. And this Metoo movement started in 2006, but it really gained traction in 2017. It was originally a way of showing solidarity with women who had endured or suffered sexual violence. It was like an anti-sexual harassment hashtag, but it's now gained momentum, and many women it's grown beyond just a hashtag. It's a movement to try to end women's suffering and harassment towards women in many arenas of life. And it's drawn more attention to how people in positions of power, in politics, and even in the media abuse their position and often harass women. And this is something you should also study on your own. In addition to what's in your book, just to be up to speed with some of the social changes that are taking place for women across the world. And of course, in other parts of the world, there are still huge steps that need to be taken for women to achieve equality with men, or at least more equal footing with men. I know when I traveled through the Middle East, especially when I went to my home country of Iraq, in some ways women have some equal rights, and in other ways there are certain norms or expectations of women that are more traditional, more conservative. So that is a little bit about some of the changes to gender. And of course, now there are also changes that we can talk about with the LGBTQ movement, and changes to how we perceive what is biologically constructed and what is biological and what is a culturally constructed idea of gender. And you'll also start to see, at least in schools, people identifying as non-binary. So in the United States, for example, you might hear people using pronouns that are not biologically based gender pronouns. So someone might, use they as a pronoun. And that's something else you can look into through more research. I hope some of this was interesting to you and that you'll do more research on your own.